Hi, I'm Merrick. I was 16 when my parents handed me my first rent bill. No speech, no soft landing. Just a folded slip of paper on my pillow between my work boots and the stack of homework I hadn't finished. $400 due by the end of the month. Signed, Mom and Dad. That was my introduction to adulthood. The house wasn't a mansion, but it was a landmark in our small town. A two-story wraparound porch, white paint fading at the edges, green shutters that my father refused to replace. Adds character, he'd say. The same house my grandfather built after coming back from the war. The same house where my brother Lucas got his first car on the front lawn. The same house where my sister Megan celebrated graduating college debt-free. And me? I paid rent to sleep in the basement. I stared at the paper in my hands for a long time before heading downstairs. The kitchen smelled like roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the comfort food of families that believed in tough love. Lucas was leaning back in his chair, arms spread wide like he owned the place, going on about a new investment idea. Sports gear that tracks performance in real time, he said, like it was revolutionary. Dad listened with the kind of rapt attention he reserved for stock market reports. Megan sat across from him, scrolling her phone, showing Mom pictures of her recent shopping trip. New boots, a leather jacket, something designer. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and slid the rent note across the table. So, rent? Mom glanced at it like she'd forgotten. Oh, right, yeah, she smiled, almost apologetic. We just think it's time you learned a little responsibility. Lucas doesn't pay rent. Lucas grinned, sipped his iced tea. I'm investing in my future, different story. Megan, Mom touched her arm. She's still in school. I blinked. So, I'm the only one? Dad finally chimed in, voice steady. You're different, Merrick. You've got potential. Lucas needs a cushion while he builds something. Megan's still finding her footing. But you need to learn how to stand on your own. I couldn't argue, not out loud. That's how things worked in my house. You nodded, swallowed hard, and figured it out, so I did. I picked up extra shifts at the hardware store after school, stocked shelves, hauled lumber, learned how to fix a leaky pipe faster than any plumber in town. Every dollar, half of it disappeared into that rent envelope. Megan, meanwhile, took a spring break trip to Cancun. Lucas crashed his Jeep. Dad covered the repairs. I paid rent, on time, every month, while the house creaked with entitlement above me. It wasn't that I didn't want to contribute. I knew life wasn't free, but I wanted to be seen. Not as the kid filling a quota for Dad's lessons in manhood, but as a son. I remember fixing the kitchen sink one Saturday morning. Water everywhere, tools scattered, my knees soaked. Dad walked in, coffee in hand. Good job, Merrick. Always reliable. No offer to help, no mention of waiving that month's rent. Just reliable. A word that felt less like a compliment and more like a position I'd been hired to fill. By the time I was 19, I had paid over $10,000 in rent to sleep under that roof. Lucas had burned through 2 business ventures, but Dad kept investing. Megan changed majors twice, still no rent. Mom called it support. When I mentioned starting my own business, something small, a repair shop maybe, Dad didn't even lower his newspaper. You've got steady hands, Merrick. People like you're made for supporting roles. Supporting roles. I kept that line close, right next to every rent receipt I saved, every dollar I handed over without question. Not because I needed proof I'd paid, but because I knew one day they'd forget I ever did, and I couldn't afford to forget. The moment I knew I'd never belong, it wasn't the rent, or the repairs, or even the missed birthdays where Lucas and Megan stole the spotlight. It was the Christmas dinner where Dad toasted to his legacy, to Lucas taking over the family investments, Megan following her dreams. And me? You're the rock, Dad said, smiling at me across the table. Solid, always holding us up. Everyone raised their glasses, and I sat there nodding. But inside, I wasn't holding them up. I was holding on. Have you ever held your family together, only to realize you were the only one who never felt at home? The first time Lucas's business failed, Dad called it a learning opportunity. It was a custom sportswear brand. Lucas spent 6 months designing logos and ordering bulk hoodies from some factory overseas. When the boxes arrived, half the sizes were wrong, the colors mismatched, and he hadn't factored in the cost of shipping for returns. Within 3 months, he was in the red. Dad wrote him a check. That's what family does, he said at dinner one night, his voice filled with certainty, like he was passing down wisdom. We back each other up, Megan chimed in from across the table, grinning. Guess that makes Lucas the visionary. I laughed, soft but sharp. Guess that makes me the bank. Dad's eyes flicked up from his plate. Watch your tone. I bit back the words I wanted to say. Instead, I finished my meal in silence, stacking my dishes, rinsing them clean like always. The second failure came faster. A mobile app this time, some nonsense about gamifying workouts. Lucas never coded a day in his life, but Dad funded him again, certain his boy would figure it out. He always did. I watched from the basement, rent paid, lights kept on, wondering how many times failure looked like ambition when it came from the right person. But I didn't speak, not then. Megan, meanwhile, floated through life like a leaf on water. She changed majors twice, psychology, then interior design. Dad paid tuition, Mom covered books. When Megan moved back home after college, her room upstairs stayed hers, untouched. No rent, no utilities, just comfort. One night, as I hauled my laundry up the stairs, I overheard Megan on the phone with a friend, laughing about a weekend trip to Napa Valley. "I'll just ask Dad," she said, like money was a faucet that never ran dry. I passed by Dad in the living room, football game on, remote in one hand, beer in the other. "Need anything?" he asked without looking up. I almost laughed. "No, Dad, I've got it covered." As always. The third time Lucas failed, it wasn't subtle. He borrowed money from outside investors, friends of Dad's, people from church. When the business went under, the shame wasn't just his. It spread like oil across water, staining everything. One night, Dad knocked on the door to the basement. That didn't happen often. "Merrick," he said, voice lower than usual, like he was trying to hide the weight. "Lucas is in a bind." I nodded slowly. "What kind of bind?" Dad hesitated. "The house is on the line." I set down the wrench I'd been using, wiped my hands on a rag. "Our house?" Dad cleared his throat. "Just some refinancing, short term, to keep things afloat." I stared at him. "This house. The one I paid rent for, the one I fixed, the one I held up while they watched Lucas fall again and again." "You ever think about refinancing me?" I asked, the words sharp but steady. Dad's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," I said, "it's not." I spent that night lying awake, listening to the creak of the floorboards above me, the sound of a family I was never really part of. By morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg for fairness. I was going to start keeping score. I opened a second bank account that week, quietly, shifted my savings there. I logged every repair I made, every bill I paid, dated, signed, stored in a folder I kept under the floorboard of my bed, because something inside me knew. One day they'd come back asking for more, and this time, I'd be ready. Have you ever felt like the only one who paid their way, while everyone else lived on promises? I knew something was off before anyone said a word. Dinner had ended early, plates cleared too fast. Dad set his fork down like it weighed too much, and Megan kept tapping her nails on the table, scrolling through her phone but not really looking at anything. Even Lucas was quieter than usual, poking at the ice in his glass. When Dad asked me to stay behind after dinner, I already knew what was coming. That tone, the one he used when things were about to be packaged as family business, it wasn't new, but this time it sounded heavier, like he wasn't sure how much longer the package could hold. Mom smiled thinly. "This won't take long." I sat down, crossing my arms over my chest, waiting. "We're asking for help," Dad started, folding his hands like a preacher about to deliver bad news as if it were scripture. "Just something small. Temporary." Megan chimed in too quickly. "It's not a big deal, Merrick." I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me. "Then why does it feel like a big deal?" Dad exhaled through his nose, something between frustration and exhaustion. "Lucas hit a rough patch. His investors are nervous. The house is tied up in that." I let the words settle. Tied up. Like the house was just another piece on Lucas's chessboard. The same house I'd been paying rent on since 16. The house I'd patched, fixed, held together while they poured money into Lucas's next big idea. "What kind of patch?" I asked, though I already knew. Dad cleared his throat. "If we don't make the payments this quarter, we could lose the house." Megan shifted in her seat, finally looking up from her phone. "It's just temporary, Merrick. You know Dad always has a plan." I almost laughed. "Yeah? The last plan worked out great." Lucas stayed quiet, hands folded, head down like a schoolboy waiting for the lecture to end. "How much?" I asked, even though I hated myself for it. Dad named a number, enough to hurt, enough to make me question every decision that led me to that table. Mom reached across, her hands soft on mine. "We know you've been steady." That word again. Steady, reliable, predictable, the human safety net. I wanted to explode, wanted to throw every rent check in their faces, Wanted to ask why the one who always paid was the one they came to when they ran out of options. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded. I'll think about it, Dad smiled, relieved. That's all we ask. That night, I sat at the desk in my basement, my rented space in a home I'd never owned, and stared at the balance in my savings account. Years of scraping, side gigs, overtime hours at the garage. All of it meant for something else. Maybe my own place, maybe my own life. But here I was again, their fallback plan. I pulled out the folder, the one where I'd been logging every payment since the day I got that first rent bill. Each line neat, dated, methodical. I added another, bailout discussion, $18,000 requested, no commitment, just facts, cold, clean. Because if they were going to treat me like a ledger, I was going to be one. The following week felt like waiting for a storm that wouldn't break. Dad dropped hints at dinner, stories about sacrifice and families sticking together. Megan acted like nothing was happening, planning her next weekend getaway. Lucas, he couldn't even look me in the eye. One evening, I found him in the garage, hunched over the workbench, fiddling with tools he didn't know how to use. Rough day, I asked. He jumped like I'd caught him stealing. Yeah, you could say that. I leaned against the doorframe. So, what's the plan? He frowned. What do you mean? I shrugged. For the business, for the investors, for the house. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. Dad says it'll work out. Does he? Lucas looked up, eyes wide, almost childlike in their uncertainty. You always had it easy, Merrick. I barked a laugh. Easy? You didn't have the pressure, the expectations. Right, just the rent. That conversation stayed with me. Easy, that's how they saw it. Like my invisibility was a blessing. I was the ghost that held the walls together while they lived inside them. I finally agreed to the bailout. Quietly, no fight, no protest. I wired the money into Dad's account and added another entry to the folder. Bailout payment, $18,000 sent. But that night, I also did something I'd never done before. I opened my laptop and started researching real estate trusts, holding companies, silent investments. I read about how to buy property without anyone knowing your name. Because I knew this wasn't the last time they'd ask. And next time, I wouldn't be the one left with nothing. Ever feel like the only one holding everything up, while no one sees the weight on your back? The call came on a Sunday. Sunday was supposed to be quiet. Coffee, a walk to clear my head, maybe patching the dented fence in the backyard that no one else seemed to care about. But that morning, my phone lit up with Dad's name before I could even take the first sip. I let it ring once, twice, picked it up on the third like I hadn't hesitated. Merrick, his voice was already in motion, skipping the greetings. You got a minute? Sure, I said, though the weight in my chest told me I shouldn't have. There was a pause, the kind that comes before something gets dropped. It's about the house, he said. Of course it was. I met them at the kitchen table that evening. Same spot, same posture, Dad at the head like it was his throne, Mom beside him, hands folded neatly, and Lucas slouched in a chair across from me, eyes darting like he wished he were anywhere else. Megan wasn't there. Napa Valley again, or maybe Tahoe this time. The house felt smaller in those moments. Not because it was falling apart, it wasn't, but because it was cracking at the seams emotionally, held together by duty and avoidance. Dad cleared his throat, glancing at Lucas before speaking. We've got an opportunity. Opportunity, I repeated, leaning back, arms crossed. That's new. Mom's smile wavered. It's refinancing, Merrick. Just for a little while longer. To give Lucas the room he needs. The room he needed. Not the house, not the family, just Lucas. I glanced at my brother. He didn't meet my gaze. How much this time? I asked, though the answer wouldn't change what I felt. Dad laid out the numbers, rattling off interest rates and percentages like we were in a boardroom. Except this wasn't a business deal. This was their house. The one they'd borrowed against so many times it was a miracle the walls still stood. They didn't ask me directly. They just expected, like the steady one always says yes. I nodded slowly, then leaned forward. What's the plan if I say no? The word stopped Dad cold. He blinked, his jaw tightening like I'd asked something inappropriate. We're not looking for conflict here, he said. I'm not either, I replied, but I'm curious. What happens if I'm not the one to fix it this time? Silence. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. Mom's hand twitched toward mine but stopped short. Dad straightened, voice low. You know we can't do this without you. There it was, the admission they never quite gave me before. I wasn't the son. I was the solution, the fallback, the financial crutch. And suddenly I realized they didn't respect me. They relied on me. I'll think about it, I said, rising from the table before they could argue. I left them there, in the kitchen of a house I'd paid to keep standing, their unspoken expectations clinging to me like smoke. But when I reached my room, the basement they'd rented to their son, I didn't sit down. I pulled out the folder, logged the request, and then I opened my laptop, because thinking about it wasn't enough this time. I needed to plan. I started with the basics, property values in the area, the fine print on refinancing agreements, the structure of holding companies. I learned how investors buy property anonymously, shielding names behind layers of trusts and silent partnerships. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but neither was living in a house that never felt like mine. I kept working at the garage, clocked extra hours, poured what I could into that separate account. And all the while I smiled at family dinners, nodded when Dad talked about Lucas's next venture, and laughed when Megan joked about being the favorite. They didn't see the shift, but I did. I wasn't holding them up anymore, I was stepping back. Months passed before Dad brought it up again. This time it wasn't at the table. It was in the driveway, leaning against his truck, arms crossed like we were two men discussing the weather. I hate to ask, he started. I shook my head, smiling without humor. No, you don't. He looked away, chuckling softly. Lucas is close, really close. Just needs one more shot. I nodded like I understood, like I wasn't already lining up the pieces. I'll wire something over, I said. And I did, but this time, I bought something else too, a stake in their house. It started small, an investment firm buying distressed properties in the area. I learned how to buy the debt, how to position myself as the lender, not the borrower. They didn't see it, they didn't know, but every time they leaned on me, I leaned back harder, quietly, patiently, building my leverage. Because the steady one doesn't make noise, the steady one waits. Have you ever been the foundation everyone stands on, until you decide to step out from under them? There's a particular way Dad asked for things. He never used the word need. That would have implied weakness. Instead, he'd wrap it up in words like opportunity or family investment. That's how he framed it the next time they called me back to the table. I knew the signs. The way Mom wouldn't quite meet my eyes, busying herself with coffee mugs even though no one had asked for one. The way Lucas cleared his throat but didn't speak. Megan, fresh from another trip, this time Cabo, scrolled through her phone like she wasn't really there. Dad leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers over his stomach. Merrick, we're close. I stayed silent. He glanced at Lucas, who gave a weak smile, then back at me. Lucas has a new venture lined up. It's different this time, lower risk. We've learned a lot. Lucas nodded like that was supposed to mean something. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. So, what's the ask? Dad smiled, that practiced, easy smile that felt less like warmth and more like a transaction. It's not a bailout, just a little breathing room. Help us refinance. This new project could really set things right. I could have laughed, could have reminded them I'd heard that before. Instead, I let the quiet stretch, watched the cracks in the performance show. Lucas's jaw tightened. Mom's hand trembled just slightly as she set down a cup. How much breathing room, I asked. Dad named a number. It was larger than before, enough that, if I weren't careful, it would have hollowed out everything I'd built. I stared at him, at all of them. The people who'd called me steady as an excuse not to see me. The people who had no idea they were standing on me. And this time, I smiled. Let me get back to you. That night, I sat in the basement, my rented room in the house they wanted me to save, and opened my laptop. The account I'd been building had grown. Not enough to buy my way out completely, but enough to do damage where it counted. I made a call. Not to the bank, to the investment firm I'd researched, the one that bought up distressed properties and bundled them like trading cards. I want to purchase the debt, I said, quietly. They didn't ask why. Money speaks louder than motive. The house wasn't just tied up in loans. It was drowning in them. Lucas had used it as collateral for more than one failed business, and Dad had refinanced so many times the walls should have collapsed. I bought the debt piece by piece, silent, invisible. They didn't know. A few weeks later, Dad called again. We're ready, he said, his voice light like this was all just a formality. Let's move forward. I didn't rush. Actually, I said, leaning back in my chair, the hum of the garage in the background. I've been thinking. There was a pause on the line. You always have, Dad said, half a chuckle. I can't help this time. Silence. Then the scrape of Dad's throat clearing. Merrick, you know what's at stake. I do. I could hear the shift, the moment the mask cracked. We're talking about the house, the family home. I closed my eyes, let the weight of it settle. Yeah, I said softly. We are. That night, I logged into my account, watched as the final piece of debt transferred over, signed quietly by the firm I'd partnered with. I owned the house. Not on paper they'd recognize, but where it counted. I kept showing up. Family dinners, Lucas's empty business pitches, Megan's stories about her next trip, and no one saw it coming. They still thought I was the net. But I'd cut the cords weeks ago. The week before Christmas, Dad brought it up one last time. In the driveway, leaning on his truck like we were two men making plans. You sure about this? He asked, voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I looked at him, the man who'd taught me how to fix things, how to hold it all together. I'm sure. He nodded, but I saw the fear behind his eyes, the quiet realization that maybe for the first time I wasn't going to catch them. I went back inside, logged the conversation in my folder, every word, every ask, and waited, because the steady one never makes noise. But he knows when to let things fall. Ever hold your family up so long they forgot you could let go? I didn't intend for it to happen on Christmas. That was their choice. The house was dressed up the way it always was, strings of lights along the roofline, a wreath on the door, stockings hung by the fireplace that hadn't held real warmth in years. Megan was back from wherever she'd been last, laughing too loudly about some beach trip, and Lucas had found a new pitch, a new idea that Dad nodded along with like it was gospel. I played my part, poured the coffee, smiled in the photos, sat through the same stories as if they didn't weigh me down, because the steady one always plays along, but not this year. The letter arrived in the morning mail, a plain envelope, no festive print, no signature, just the logo of Silent Holdings LLC, the company I'd set up, faceless and cold, just like they'd treated me. Dad opened it first at the head of the table. His hands, the same hands that had held me steady on my first bike ride, trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. Mom leaned in, her lips pressed together before she even read it. Lucas craned his neck, trying to see over Dad's shoulder. Megan scrolled through her phone, oblivious. It took a minute for them to process. Then Dad cleared his throat, tried to speak, but the words tangled. Mom read it aloud instead. Notice of foreclosure. Silent Holdings LLC has acquired the outstanding debt on this property. All occupants must vacate within 60 days. Silence. Except for Megan, who laughed, thinking it was a mistake. What kind of scam is this? Lucas grabbed the letter, scanning it, his face draining pale. Dad looked at me, eyes sharp, searching for some answer. Merrick, he said, low, warning. Did you know about this? I met his gaze. I am Silent Holdings. Mom gasped, covering her mouth. Megan stared like I'd spoken in another language. Lucas's mouth opened, then closed. No words. Dad rose slowly from his chair, gripping the table's edge like it was the only thing holding him up. You're bluffing. I shook my head. You taught me better than that. The tension broke, sharp, sudden. Dad's voice snapped through the room. This is our house. No, I said, steady, calm. It's mine now. After everything we've done for you? His voice cracked, raw with disbelief. After the roof we kept over your head? I laughed softly. Bitterness and sorrow tangled together. You didn't keep a roof over my head. I paid rent. I kept this house standing. Lucas stood, slamming his hands on the table. This is family. You don't do this to family. I turned to him, eyes steady. No, you don't do this to family. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they'd ignored, every time they'd called me steady like it was a compliment instead of a chain. I'm not kicking you out tonight, I said, voice even. You've got 60 days. Dad shook his head, sinking back into his chair like he couldn't hold himself up anymore. Mom's eyes brimmed, but she didn't speak. Megan? She just stared, stunned, the phone slipping from her hands. I stood, sliding my chair back quietly. You taught me I didn't belong here, I said, glancing around the table, around the house that had never really been mine. So I made sure I didn't. I left them there, in the house I now owned. The days that followed weren't easy. Megan tried to reason with me. Lucas texted me twice, calling me cold, saying, Mom doesn't deserve this. Dad never called. Mom wrote once, a long letter, apologizing without saying the word, reminding me of birthdays and holidays, of moments that she thought counted more than the years they'd leaned on me without seeing me. I read it, and I filed it away. I didn't evict them early. I let the 60 days run their course, gave them space to figure out their next move. When the day came, I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching as the moving truck pulled away. Dad wouldn't look at me. Lucas muttered under his breath. Megan cried. Mom stood there for a long moment. "You could have talked to us," she whispered. I nodded. "I did. You just weren't listening." I kept the house. Not for me. I turned it into a place for people like me, young adults trying to find their footing, the ones who paid rent in homes that never felt like theirs. I called it steady foundation, because sometimes the ones who hold everything up deserve something solid too. Have you ever realized that sometimes the only way to stand tall is to stop holding others up? Sometimes walking away doesn't mean giving up. It means reclaiming what should have never been taken. I told this story not for revenge, but to remind anyone listening, your worth isn't measured by how much you hold others up. It's found when you decide to stand for yourself. If this resonated with you, share your thoughts or tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how this lands for you. And if it didn't, let me know why. I'm here for honest stories and honest feedback. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join me for the next one.